Welcome to the Video Jungle Podcast. I am Artie Gold. This is Justin Andrews.
That's me.
And Justin, we had a guest on last season, Tim O'Donnell, who became a really good friend of our business. He does documentaries, and I would say for a living. But I don't know how he pays for them all, but he does like 5 in a row. And just boom, 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 boom.
Makes no sense. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant man.
Keeps going. What I love about Tim is he just has a passion for telling stories and like finding the right story. And he just is one of those guys that just, I don't know if it's because it's who he is or because he really actively searched, but he always seems to find the right audience and the right story.
And what you really get the sense of is this desire to make an impact, right? We talk about getting this thing distributed via Netflix and that goal of the big channel picking it up. But the reality is, as an indie filmmaker, they care much more about the impact that they can make with the audience that their subject represents.
And I think that's a valid point because we had our own experience with kind of a social impact type of documentary you directed with Alyssa and Dare to Be Remarkable, where I remember you always being of sound mind to say, like, this is for the SMA audience. This is the impact we want to make. It wasn't really about getting on HBO or Netflix or trying to push it. I think we were all kind of internally happy about just being able to tell her story because we knew it was going to have an impact.
I mean, we still get emails from her about like families that have a diagnosed child with SMA that reach out to her just thanking her for her story being available. That was our goal. That was it. It wasn't to make a ton of money. And you hear that through Tim and John, who found this great story, this story that like you would just expect that it's a non-issue in 2019. So they tapped into a great story, and then they tapped into the community around that story to make sure that the story had the right platform with the right audience.
And we will talk a little bit, or I should say they will talk a little bit about their distribution experience and how they strove it forward. The thing that I'm always conflicted with when we even internally tell our stories, but I always ask everybody, it's like, when do you stop telling that story, right? Even with Alyssa, you started with a 4-minute concept just telling her story that turned into a larger story because we knew the story was there, but we followed her for a long time. And they did the same thing with their subject as well, as they followed her for 4.5 years. It's like, we talk about like, when do you stop? When do you know when the right time to stop is? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think they knew that they had a good enough story to stay on it. And it is a shame that it didn't get picked up because it sounded like everything went smoothly. So we live in a weird world where you can make an impact. You don't need it to be distributed to the masses. You can make an impact. So my message to anyone listening to this episode is like, listen to it and then think of the person that you know that if you got their story out there, even at a small level, it would positively change the world around you. And go ahead and do something about it.
And if you want to learn more about Tim and his bio, you can listen to the podcast that we did last year because we talk extensively of how he started and how he became a filmmaker. But for now, let's listen to Tim O'Donnell and John Mercer as they talk about life without basketball.
It's the Video Jungle Podcast. Find your fascinating.
I feel like for younger filmmakers, the best sort of advice is stick with local festivals, create obtainable goals and think of your community and who's going to actually watch this thing.
So welcoming back to our show, Tim O'Donnell, a award-winning documentary filmmaker, friend of our company, friend of myself, and also his co-director and DP, John Mercer. You guys have been on a long trail of filmmaking, indie filmmaking. Talk to me, Tim, about the film that you guys have been working on for how long? Is it like 3 years now?
Yeah, no. Thanks for having us on. We're super pumped to be back, and love the podcast, and excited to give some updates. So me and John have been working on Life Without Basketball for 4.5 years, and we released it back at festivals in late 2018. And it screened at a lot of festivals, and now we're finally releasing it online. It's available now on Amazon Prime. That just dropped like last week. We're really excited to share it. And, working with Gravitas Distribution, Gravitas Ventures, they've been great getting the film out. And now me and John have a few other films that we're finishing right now, essentially 2 feature docs at the same time. One that's been going on for 8.5 years. The second one we filmed for like a year and a half and been editing for about a year. So super duper busy time for us.
So tell me a little bit about the Life Without Basketball film we're talking about, and how it all came about. Because one of the things we always talk about and have been talking about on the podcast is it really starts with a good story, but more importantly, starts with the right person to tell that story or that story about. Correct?
Yeah, for sure. With Life Without Basketball, we didn't set out to make a feature. I previously was a teacher in Springfield, Massachusetts, and heard about, this amazing basketball player. She was breaking records. She broke Rebecca Lobo's scoring title. At the time, she got invited to, meet President Obama at the White House. She was at the White House a few times. And, she's Muslim American, and she covers, and I think her being a great player was first and foremost, but on top of it, she became the first Division I collegiate player to play with hijab, so to play covered. So she wears Under Armour swim cap essentially.
And just for the record, when you say her, who is her?
So this is Bilquis Abdul Qadir, and she originates from Springfield, Massachusetts, and went on to play at Memphis and then finish her career at Indiana State. And we just kind of started. Me and John were thinking, we'll film for a month and we'll make like a 3 or 4 minute, short documentary online, maybe festivals. And, John can tell you more too, like, it all kind of kicked off meeting her family. And I think for us, I don't know, John, what was your feeling like that first couple weeks, like hanging out with them? I feel like we both kind of were like, okay, there's something else happening here.
Yeah, I think, pretty quickly, once we met Bilquis, and then, meeting her extended family, I think we sort of realized like what we were in for, just even in terms of, access and willing to be a part of and a participant in this filmmaking process. I think that was really like the biggest moment there. Obviously the story was important. It seemed like there was kind of a lot at stake there, but I think, Bilquis and her family just really welcoming us in and being a part of that process, that was really like the turning point. And I think, that's what allowed us to be successful with filming them, over all these years.
So tell me a little bit about the actual story. I know, just for the listeners out there, if you could like sum up what made the story interesting and why she became a great central character.
When we started production on this, we were, starting to, this is like around the time, in the US where we're having a lot of conversations around Black Lives Matters, and seemed to be this like new conversation about, inequality and social justice and these kinds of things. So there's seemingly this moment of action, right, and attention. And then, we heard about the situation with Bilquis, and, Bilquis was the first Division I basketball player to play wearing hijab, had a great Division I career, and was intending on continuing that to play overseas in a FIBA league. Was scouted favorably, started that process, and her agents kind of collecting more background information on her, and at a certain point was like, hey, I think we got a problem. There's this FIBA rule which bans headscarves, head coverings from competition. I don't think you can actually play. So it's definitely a contrast, because it seemed like we were in this moment where conversations were widening around a lot of these issues in the U.S. and then here's this ruling. It's an international ruling, but it also applies to USA Olympic basketball, and it really just felt like such a huge step backwards. So we're like, all right, well, this is clearly something that needs to be done away with, right? But also, let's kind of explore what's going on here. What are some of the reasons that this rule exists? What does it happen, to an individual when they encounter something like that? When you're told by an international organization that you can't do the thing that you love, that you've been preparing for your whole life. So I think it was kind of like that moment of cohesion where it's like, this is important, and it's a really interesting time to be talking about this. And then, I don't need to tell you about the past 3+ years of this administration that have occurred since then, but as we're filming, it's like things are kind of getting worse. They're not getting better. And, Bilquis is kind of fighting her international fight, like through the midst of all that too. So it was an interesting time to be navigating all of that with her.
So we talk a lot about, when you start a film or best intentions, you think you have a story. And like you just said, Tim, this potentially was going to be a 4-minute feature on, character development of Bilkey's, and it turns into something a lot deeper, a lot bigger. I guess my question to you is, at what point is there a turning point between you and John where you're actually like subconsciously thinking like this could be international news, this could be something, you guys have a story that potentially could be everywhere above and beyond film festivals. Are you nervous that it's going to get out of control? Do you start to make decisions that don't feel organic? Walk me through the emotion of being part of this type of story.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, hopefully your intentions are always to do the best thing you can for the story. Initially, our preconceived notions of Bill Keith and her story were that we would go in and film a little bit and cut something. But me and John were very open to what was possible. And there's a lot of factors that, at the timeline of 4.5 years of making this thing, different phases of her life that we just had to hang in there and ride it. There were plenty of times where me and John both said, maybe this is it, maybe this is our ending, but there was always something to kind of keep us in the game. In terms of like changing what we were doing, all those little things that we initially shot with like a red camera at one point. We were shooting a lot of slow motion. We were thinking about the rhythm of basketball, of course, like the sort of beauty of a player, especially somebody like her. She's super fast. We wanted to kind of like break that down a little bit. And then also the rhythm and beauty of the Islam religion. The practice of praying is really, meditative and beautiful. And we were very lucky that we were sort of open. We're white men. We don't practice any religion for that matter. And John and so they just said, yeah, you can sit with us during some of the most intimate moments where they're, praying as a family. So
why do you think that was, Tim?
That?
Why do you think that was? Were they really intent on getting their story told? Did they know what was going on, or were they just super nice people?
I think there's a lot going on. I think, I think we connected as humans. I was a teacher for 6 years in Springfield. I coached wrestling. I taught art. I think that helped a little bit, but that can only be like a commonality that kind of opens the door. Ultimately, me and John had similar families, and I think we felt like we were at home. As you get older, you sort of crave that, those moments of the chaos of kids running around and, aunts and uncles popping in and out. As you get older, sometimes that stuff, you don't get to experience that. And the Abdul Qadir family is like their house is like the epicenter of an extended family. So we love that. And, I think maybe they recognized that we had really, hopefully good intentions for them, especially as time went on. And we just kept, sometimes it would be like a 14, 15-hour day. And, we're not, at the end of it, we're not pushing and prodding them. We're finding the right balance of, time to interview, time to just let them chill, time to just observe naturally. So, I think ultimately it became a relationship, and, we consider ourselves sort of extended family. We've certainly been over their house after the film was finished to just hang out, and sort of an open-ended invitation over there, which we feel really lucky. And that's what an amazing career that we have, that we can create these lifelong relationships. But ultimately the story dictated it. At some point we decided not to do slow motion. At some point, bigger camera rig is just holding us back. So the style changed a little bit with what the story dictated.
And let me ask you this, if you were to give advice for all the indie filmmakers out there that are on top of a story like this, because Tim, since I've known you, you don't seem to set too many huge deadlines to when you want to finish your film, correct? You just let that thing go, and you have different versions. Did you ever consider, between you and John, that I'm going to put a cap on when I'm going to finish telling the story, or was it still kind of just organically up in the air, and every time you thought you might have a finished product, you just kept it going?
Well, you should be always editing, and I think we were constantly working on the film. When we weren't shooting, we were editing, and both me and John were editing different scenes. We ended up, putting the film together in sort of a Frankenstein way, which we've sort of become our process in a lot of ways, where we individually cut scenes that we feel really deep, connected to, or maybe we shot more of that scene or whatever it is. So, I mean, the the proof is in the pudding. You can see what you're doing. So if you have a film that's looking pretty complete, I mean, you don't need to shoot more, right? So I think when we were editing, it always felt like there was this big gap. I don't know. What do you think, John? This is actually kind of fun to like think back to, like, why did we keep going? Because there was a point where I feel like John, me and you were like, oh, she was coaching soccer at one point. We filmed like an entire soccer season, and it was like, oh, now she's like coaching youth soccer, and that's kind of interesting. I don't know, like what was in your head, John, back then?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think, like, as a filmmaker, like I think when you have the story, right? And there's like the challenge is like there's lots of other moments that could be it, and maybe if you are feeling creatively exhausted on a project, or or you're running out of financing, any number of reasons, like it's really easy to convince yourself that, oh, this might be it, right? And you do kind of have to track down a lot of things that are happening, and sort of be okay with them not making it into the film also. So, but I think when it's actually the end, I think you can trust that instinct of like, okay, like this is actually what I was waiting for. I feel like some kind of relief here that, things have kind of concluded, as concisely as they can.
Did you do a deep dive into the deadline being associated with film festivals you wanted to be in, or active things that were happening in the world, or was that not consciously on your mind?
So we did a couple interesting things with this film that are a little counterintuitive. So one is, we released a trailer pretty early on, in advance of, let's see, I'm trying to remember which Olympic year that would have been, but there was the Summer Olympics coming up, and there was a men's team from India that was not able to play in earlier qualifications. So we were wondering, like, hey, is this going to be an Olympic story, right? Is this going to be right up there, with some of the other, more prominently featured Muslim athletes that were coming out at the games? So we pushed out a trailer in advance of that to try to affect some change there. Ultimately FIBA didn't move that season. And then there was a second point too, where, we're a little bit further along in the process. We started working with Human Rights Watch and Global Players Union, and they were sort of providing some legal assistance to Bilkis. So we're getting a little more insight into what's happening at FIBA. It seems to be the case that, this ruling is up for a vote at the next board meeting. So, one of the things that we did is we kind of adapted a short film from the Life Without Basketball material called FIBA Allow Hijab. And that was really focused on the policy and the impact, a little less of the personal story. And we pushed that out in advance of the feature in hopes of, having some impact on this voting process too, and to try to get some more eyes on it. And I think that was successful. We partnered with Uninterrupted, which is one of LeBron James's content companies, and CNN Films, Great Big Story came in on that too. So it got a lot of eyes on it, and I think it was the right thing to do for the policy change. I think it was the right thing for Bilkis, but certainly was a little counterintuitive to that idea of not influencing your story too much, right? Because we were still actively filming with her, and here we are releasing material, and if it goes well, right, it does actually change the course of the story.
When you're going through this process, and especially if you have a story that's worth telling, and agencies start reaching out to you, or other production companies, or a CNN, or USA Today even, were you nervous that they would start to influence what they were going to ask of you, and if you really wanted to make those changes?
One of the things that we push for and we look for in those relationships is having that independent editorial control. Unfortunately, we were able to find partners that allowed us to do that. But, I think the motivation for pushing out the trailer and for adapting the short early, it was the right thing for our subject, and it was the right thing for the sport.
Hey, have you heard of the internet?
I have heard of the internet, yes.
Well, maybe you haven't used it yet, but it's a thing where there's a browser and you type in stuff. And if you type findyourfascinating.com, that's the first step to learning about our process for helping businesses uncover their fascinating, brainstorm new ideas, and make some stuff happen, right?
That's the first step I would take. It's actually what I do even in our meetings.
Hey, have you heard of Netflix?
I have.
It's a website that helps you find movies and curate things that watch interesting stuff that you might like.
That's kind of what findyourfascinating.com is going to do too.
Nothing like that.
It's not even apples to
No,
apples.
no. Those are just two things that are cool.
That's nice. When we did our film festival stuff, we got reached out from like Condé Nast and a couple other people, but it was really kind of challenging because, you know, they would reach back and say, hey, we would like this story, but we'd want this to happen, or we want this to happen. But we were always kind of conflicted about what the right lane of the highway was. Did you guys really talk amongst yourselves about which lane of distribution you wanted to go with? I know, Tim, when I first met you, especially on some of your old films you were doing, you had some experience with actually getting meetings with like the Netflixes of the world. And can you just explain to people what those types of meetings and experiences are like?
So yeah, me and John met with Netflix a while back. Super fun meeting. They have a really unique model where you don't necessarily need to be in acquisitions to pitch material. So we met with somebody who was outside of acquisitions, and they have sort of an open door policy at Netflix. So if, let's say, somebody that's working maybe even on accounting or something, or analytics, if they feel really passionate about a story or film, they have the ability to pitch it inside of Netflix. So me and John have been working with veterans for the past 10 years on various documentary storytelling, event-based stuff. It's really widened quite a bit, initially just being films, and now it seems like we're getting more and more involved in, as John was saying previously, outcomes. You know, how can these stories and these relationships affect change, whether it's on a smaller scale or a bigger scale, like, you know, a rule for headscarves, right? Like that's a great example of like that going really well, where we might have had a little bit of influence in that rule changing. But anyways, you know, this gentleman was a veteran, and he heard about some of the films me and John were working on, had kind of in pre-production and in production stuff. And so we were able to go and pitch, and, you know, kind of even going back a little bit about distribution, I feel like me and John never like dream of like a film just like being picked up by HBO. I mean, yeah, of course you're gonna have those dreams here or there, but like, that's not like, we're not like hinged on that. Ultimately, we're making these films and weaving them into our commercial work. And there's never pressure to make money or to have like this great outcome. You know, we're always pushing ourselves. You know, we're competitors for sure. We try to make the best films. We apply to the biggest festivals. We put that out there, but our expectations aren't going to be connected to those results. The true, you know, feeling of like we failed or we succeed is totally in the film, right? And how people feel about that film, that's close to that community. But, you know, Life Without Basketball ended up, you know, we have like a great distribution team. We're super happy with Gravitas, but early on, you know, we've met with some of those bigger players, that sort of like bigger, you know, home run sort of distribution situation where, you know, there's a big channel that picks it up. We found that the film just opened doors in some ways. You know, we were able to go to a bunch of festivals, meet with a bunch of people, and, you know, start to form relationships, and have to start somewhere. And I think, you know, Life Without Basketball is a great example of what we can do in some ways, and how, you know, what we care about, you know, and when you talk to us, you can see our intentions, where they are and where our values are. So, I don't know, you know, I think it's like this bigger, longer game of being able to make work, you know, and ultimately, if we have a bunch of relationships and we have more opportunity to share films, that's kind of the greater goal, not just this one film, but, you know, this whole lifetime of making all these different stories and getting to have a wider audience. That's kind of, I think, kind of like our perspective at this point, you know, not necessarily worrying too much about one film, but the greater good of like the bigger picture.
I think like the most interesting thing that happens at any of these meetings where you're pitching or you're trying to sell through to distribution, like our experience, you know, after our initial festival premiere, I feel like, you know, Tim, like we were talking about it as like, we would just have meetings and calls, and they would be like the best meeting and the best call ever. Like everything about it went well. And then and then it's like maybe there's a follow-up, you get back on the phone and like that goes super well, and then nothing happens, and it's like, what are we missing here? Like, I feel like that was like, we had a connection, things are going, people love the project, and it's like, all right, well, so you want to do this? Like, what all are we talking about here? And like a lot of times it just like, it wouldn't go anywhere other than like having another great call. So
I think you got to be careful of thinking about that end result of a huge audience. I've never had success trying to get to a big audience without thinking about that immediate grassroots audience that you have in your backyard, that audience that's connected to the community of the subject, and anything else that might be connected to the story or the person that's in the film. That's the strongest approach in my small history of making films, is really making sure you're telling that community, letting that community know. I mean, you look at Not a War Story, it's a feature. It's our first feature doc me and John made, and we didn't get picked up by any distribution. We got into maybe like 1 or 2 film festivals, but our audience was veterans. We were lucky to have a bunch of military apparel companies also that are kind of connected with that, and a lot of influential veterans and and movie stars as well, of course, are in that movie, like Marcus Luttrell, Tim Kennedy, Medal of Honor recipients, William Shatner and Sean Astin. But it all came back to connecting with a veteran audience. So when we released it on iTunes, we had thousands, tens of thousands of people posting in a way that wasn't just like, oh, like share this, like deeply passionate people being like, you need to freaking see this, like people calling their like cousin, like, hey dude, freaking go on iTunes and buy this. Like we had people working, like for free. They felt passionate that other people needed to see this story about what it's like to serve, come back home, and then what, and to want a mission, like making a Hollywood movie with zombies, stuff like that. And so we just followed that, that film. And then on the distribution side, we were lucky to have a bunch of veterans push it. And we were number 1 on iTunes documentaries for a while. We were in the top 50 for a while too, with some of the major films.
Yeah. Well, so I think one of the biggest goals for this project is to really have a film that felt like it was for the community that the story was coming from, right? So, we want for Bilkis and, for other Muslim Americans to like see a figure here that they can look up to. All of these young girls that are in her training camps, I mean, it's so important that they have that contact with Bilkis, because it's a life-changing encounter to see someone doing the thing that you want to do successfully. So in a similar way, like one of our goals was, for Bilkis to be able to take this project and to incorporate it into some of the public speaking that she had started to do, and to really bring it out into the community with her continuing to be the face of that. So we've had a lot of luck in other educational settings, whether that's a high school or a middle school or a university audience. I think it's an audience that is open to, hearing about some of the subjects that are involved in the film. And, the influence there is so important. And Bilkis is really the right person to continue to deliver that message. So more than anything else, like if she's able to take that out in the world and continue to have influence, that's a success for us, If we get on to, if we get on to HBO or Netflix, like awesome, right? But we're really trying to accomplish something a lot bigger than that with the film.
Yeah, I feel like there's 2 things that kind of like come to mind. The first is maybe the best compliment that me and John could have received, and we've heard this a couple times at different screenings where there's a Muslim American in the audience, and they say, I just feel like I just watched a movie that featured Muslims and not in a way that it's like the typical tropes of how we typically see a Muslim American family. This just feels like an American story. And it really is, it's a hardworking middle-class family. They have their struggles, for sure, that it's in the film. And we're following Bilkis through this, really challenging time. But that right there, I mean, that was our intention, to tell the real sort of American family story that just happened to feature Muslim Americans. So right there, that felt like, something good's happening. On the other side, it's really interesting because, Bilquis is still young. Like, when we started filming, she was like 23, and now she's a little older, and we've sort of seen her advocacy platform grow, and her as a individual speaker also grow from, very small audiences here and there to now, she gets invited to these really big major national conferences. She gets invited to the Human Rights Watch events, and now she's speaking to, people who are the CMO at Adidas, and changers, she's now has an audience that people are listening to her. So this film is a great thing for her now to continue to take and, use at events. Sometimes it's an inverse. Sometimes, we'll get asked to screen somewhere, and then they'll say, hey, can we have Bilquis come and speak, after seeing the film? So it's a really cool thing that happens with the film when, it's not just for our sake, but Bilquis in a larger dialogue. And, we've seen some really cool events where they'll invite maybe me or John or Bilquis, and then have a panel, and it's a mixed group. And, what they're trying to do is have dialogue between, what's it like to be a Muslim American, and then folks that aren't on that side to kind of understand and get a little bit deeper into what that's like. And that's the best thing right there, is to have that conversation, right? And to create a little more awareness and to create a little more commonality. So, it's been really rad.
So, first of all, guys, thanks for coming on, and congratulations on your indie film success thus far. Where can people watch Life Without Basketball?
You can check Life Without Basketball on pretty much every platform. You can buy it on iTunes. Right now, it's streaming for free on Amazon Prime. It's on Vudu. John, what else? There's a ton of platforms. I think like every platform you can possibly stream.
Wherever you buy and rent right now, it's available. And for free on Prime if you're a Prime member, which is great.
All right, Artie, I know you really wanted to have Tim back on this episode, but not to go like this deep dive into a conversation about his life, to talk about Life Without Basketball, this incredible documentary, and more importantly, the conversations that he had from a distribution side with some of the big players out there like Netflix. So what did you enjoy about hearing Tim and John's story here?
It's interesting because we had met Tim maybe like a half year into when he started filming this. So we started doing some projects with him, and we started collaborating a little bit. And he had just finished his first film. And when I had him on the podcast the first time, he started telling me about Life Without Basketball. And it started, like you said, a small little story. Tim has always intrigued me because if you meet Tim, he's kind of this laid back kind of guy. He's very sociable, very likable. But then he started telling me, like, he started making connections with Netflix and Hulu, and he was having these meetings. And I was just fascinated because, we try to get those meetings. Everybody in the film industry tries to get those meetings. But he was getting the calls. He went out to California. He met with these people. And the first question I always asked him was, what are those meetings like, Tim? And he was very funny because they're not what you thought, right? They're not like these big boardrooms with glass windows everywhere and this like big monitor and a big guy comes in a suit. He's like, a lot of times I sit in a small office with like their accountant, because like you said, Netflix has this process where anybody can make a pitch anytime. And I think the frustrating thing that he kept saying was, and he said it in this podcast, was you'd have a great phone call and then they would just not get back to you. Right. And I think that in our world, we're not used to that. I know you aren't. You're very good with emails and phone calls, and I was getting frustrated for him because I was getting frustrated for him because I was texting him like, hey, what's going on? He was like, I don't know, and he wasn't saying like, because sometimes you can't tell because there's NDAs or you just don't want to jinx it or whatever. But he legitimately did not know what was going on. I found that, and I still find it very frustrating because if you produce something that you think has legs, that's kind of the ultimate goal. What I learned about this whole process from specifically Tim and this podcast is just being able to say, okay, maybe that's not the promised land. What do you do if it doesn't work out that way?
Right.
Because you have a film, you have something to do.
There's nothing worse than this idea of making something that you're proud of, making something that is a good story, making something that can make an impact. But if you don't get it anywhere, if nobody sees it, it can't make an impact. So that Netflix would be a big win. Right, like financially it'd be a win, but more importantly for them, impact-wise it'd be a win. It would give them a platform to continue making more stories and make a difference. And I would venture to guess that one day they'll have something on Netflix. but they ensured that the backup plan was solid and that this thing was going to be delivered to the right community. And that is really the big part of this story is where is the community that's going to help build momentum around a project like Life Without Basketball. And they're pretty experienced at that.
Sometimes, and I'm at fault for this a lot, is when you edit something or you're in the middle of something, you try to keep it like secret or close to the vest and you don't want to release things. They consistently edit trailers. They consistently edit smaller versions of what they're doing. They consistently take one little storyline and just make it the small story and get it out there. They don't worry too much about, is it ready or not, the big game, but they consistently push, because by the time the big thing happens, they have built that audience that way. And I think that's a great lesson for everybody out there. One I personally am going to start trying to do when we start.
Yeah. I mean, we could start with our short version of Life Without Basketball, which would be a lot. It'd be terrible because it'd be stories of people with
bad ACLs,
ACL injuries, and also just not being good at basketball.
Well, you're pretty good. I've seen you play. I think I'm fairly decent. I just can't move
physically,
and jump.
I just
I have
can't
no
physically
ACL in my left knee anymore.
I play a lot of mental basketball. It's pretty good. I dunk in it too.
This has been the Video Jungle Podcast. Find your fascinating. A product of Animus Studios